The electricity coursed through the abandoned gymnasium like lightning, illuminating Maya Chen's terrified face for a split second before everything went black. The taser hit the concrete floor with a metallic clang, sparks still dancing from its prongs. Blake Morrison stood frozen, his expensive sneakers squeaking against the dusty floor as he realized what he'd just done. What they'd all just done. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own panicked breathing and the distant hum of fluorescent lights in the hallway beyond. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But here's the thing about cornering a fighter. Even when they don't know they're one yet, sometimes the prey becomes the predator faster than you can blink. And Blake Morrison was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Let me take you back 3 months earlier, to a gray October morning in Portland, when the rain fell like tiny hammers against the windows of Riverside High School. Maya Chen sat in the back corner of her AP literature class, hood pulled up despite the indoor heating, fingers wrapped around a worn paperback copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. She'd read it 17 times, but the story of revenge and justice never got old. Maybe because justice felt like such a foreign concept in her daily life. At 17, Maya had perfected the art of invisibility. She moved through Riverside's crowded hallways like a ghost, keeping her head down, earbuds in, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might mistake her presence for an invitation to interact. Her strategy had worked for 3 years running. She attended classes, turned in perfect assignments, and went home to her mother's small apartment above Chen's corner market without causing a ripple in the social ecosystem that governed teenage hierarchies. Her mother, Maria, worked double shifts at Portland General Hospital to keep their small family of 2 afloat. They'd moved to Oregon from California after Maya's father died in a construction accident when she was 14. The insurance money had run out faster than expected, and Maria's nursing salary barely covered rent in Portland's increasingly expensive housing market. Maya understood this without being told, just like she understood why her mother's eyes were always tired, and why they ate dinner from the clearance section of their own market most nights. Maya had learned to need nothing from anyone, to expect nothing, to make herself so small that disappointment couldn't find her. It was a survival strategy born from too many moves, too many new schools, and too many fresh starts that never quite felt fresh enough. Her mother worried about her isolation, but Maya preferred it. People were complicated, unpredictable, dangerous in ways that books never were. The only exception to her self-imposed exile was Steel City Boxing, a gym tucked beneath a Vietnamese restaurant in southeast Portland. Maya had discovered it by accident 6 months after moving to Oregon, when she'd taken a wrong turn trying to find a used bookstore. She'd heard the rhythmic pounding of heavy bags through the basement windows and followed the sound like a siren call she didn't understand. Jake Sullivan, the gym's owner and head trainer, was a retired professional boxer who'd fought his way out of South Boston and somehow ended up in Portland training kids who needed somewhere to channel their anger. He was 45, heavily tattooed, with hands like concrete and eyes that saw everything. When Maya had appeared at his gym door, soaking wet from the rain and clearly lost, he'd taken one look at her and somehow seen past the shy exterior to something else underneath. "You looking for something, kid?" he'd asked, not unkindly. Maya had intended to apologize and leave, but something about the gym's atmosphere, the focus, the respect, the way everyone moved with purpose, made her hesitate. "I heard the sound," she'd said, finally. From the street. Jake had studied her for a long moment, taking in her slight frame, her defensive posture, the way she held herself like she was ready to bolt at any second. "You want to try hitting something?" That had been 8 months ago. Now, Maya spent every afternoon after school in Steel City's basement, learning to throw combinations that could drop a grown man, developing footwork that made her practically untouchable, and discovering that she had a natural talent for violence that both thrilled and terrified her. Jake never asked why she needed to learn to fight, and Maya never volunteered the information. Some truths were better left unspoken. Her mother didn't know about the boxing. Maria thought Maya was attending a study group at the library, and Maya let her believe it. It wasn't entirely a lie. She did study at the gym between training sessions, and her grades had actually improved since she'd started boxing. Physical exhaustion helped quiet the anxiety that had plagued her since her father's death. and the discipline required for training had taught her focus she'd never possessed before. Blake Morrison entered Maya's orbit on a Tuesday in late October, though she'd been peripherally aware of him since freshman year. Blake was everything Maya wasn't: loud, confident, effortlessly popular, and born into the kind of privilege that made rules feel optional. His father owned Morrison Construction, one of Portland's largest building companies, and the family name was carved into half the public buildings in the city. Blake drove a brand-new BMW to school, wore designer clothes like uniforms, and moved through Riverside High like he owned it, which, considering his father's donations to the athletic department, he basically did. Blake was also cruel in the casual way that only truly entitled people could be. He collected followers through a combination of charisma and fear, surrounding himself with kids who were either too impressed by his wealth or too afraid of his influence to challenge him. His inner circle included Connor Davis, a tech genius whose family had moved to Portland from Silicon Valley, and Ryan Torres, a soccer player whose own family struggled financially but who'd been absorbed into Blake's orbit through sports and social climbing. Maya first appeared on Blake's radar during a chemistry lab accident that wasn't really an accident. She'd been partnered with Sarah Kim, a quiet Korean-American girl who, like Maya, preferred academic achievement to social navigation. They'd been working on a fairly simple titration experiment when Connor Davis, stationed at the lab table behind them, had accidentally bumped into Sarah, causing her to spill concentrated hydrochloric acid across their workspace. The acid had splashed toward Maya's hands, and her reaction had been immediate and precise. She'd moved faster than seemed possible, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her backward, while simultaneously using a lab towel to redirect the acid's flow away from both their skin. The entire sequence had taken maybe 2 seconds, but her movements had been so fluid, so controlled, that several students had stopped their own experiments to stare. "Nice reflexes," Blake had said from across the room, his voice carrying just enough interest to make Maya's stomach clench with dread. She'd ignored him, focusing on helping Sarah clean up the mess while Mr. Peterson dealt with Connor's elaborate apologies and excuses. But Maya had felt Blake's attention like a physical weight for the rest of the class period, and she'd known with absolute certainty that her days of invisibility were numbered. The first incident happened 3 days later. Maya arrived at her locker to find it had been superglued shut. Not a sophisticated prank, but effective enough to make her late for first period and require a custodian's assistance to resolve. She'd reported it to the office, but without witnesses or evidence, there wasn't much the administration could do beyond expressing sympathy and offering to move her to a different locker. The second incident was more creative. Someone had created. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A fake social media account using Maya's name and school photo, posting desperate-sounding messages about loneliness and social awkwardness on various platforms. The posts were crafted to be just embarrassing enough to humiliate, without crossing obvious lines into harassment territory. Maya discovered the account when classmates started giving her pitying looks and whispering when she passed. She'd reported this too, but tracking down anonymous social media creators required more resources than Riverside High's overworked counselors possessed. Blake never directly claimed responsibility for these incidents, but his smug expressions whenever Maya dealt with their aftermath made his involvement clear. He was testing her, probing for weaknesses, establishing dominance in the same way predators isolated prey from the herd. Maya understood the psychology even if she couldn't stop it. The harassment escalated gradually, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger serious administrative intervention. Her backpack would disappear from the gym during PE, only to be found later in a bathroom trash can. Her car tires, she drove her mother's old Honda Civic to school, would be mysteriously flat when she left in the afternoon. Her homework assignments would vanish from teachers' desks before they could be graded. Each incident was minor enough to be dismissed as bad luck or teenage pranks, but the cumulative effect was exactly what Blake intended. Maya found herself constantly anxious, jumping at unexpected sounds, checking over her shoulder in hallways. Her grades began to slip as she spent more mental energy watching for threats than focusing on academics. Even her boxing training suffered as stress and sleep deprivation took their toll. The worst part was the isolation. Blake's social influence meant that most students either participated in the harassment or avoided Maya entirely to protect themselves. She'd never had many friends at Riverside, but now she had none. Teachers who'd previously appreciated her academic performance began seeing her as a problem student who attracted drama. Even her mother noticed the change, commenting on Maya's increased moodiness and asking repeatedly if everything was okay at school. Maya couldn't tell her mother the truth. Maria worked too hard already, and adding teenage drama to her list of worries seemed cruel. Besides, what could her mother realistically do? Complain to the school administration that had already proven ineffective? Confront Blake's father, whose construction company employed half the city? Maya had learned early that some problems couldn't be solved by adults, no matter how much they loved you. So she endured, counting down the days until graduation and telling herself she just needed to survive 8 more months. She'd been accepted to Oregon State University with a partial academic scholarship, and once she left Riverside behind, Blake Morrison would become just another unpleasant memory. She could handle 8 months of anything. That was before the taser. The breaking point came on a Friday in early November when Blake's harassment took a decidedly more dangerous turn. Maya had been leaving school later than usual after meeting with her calculus teacher about an upcoming exam when she'd noticed Connor Davis following her to the parking lot. Not walking in the same direction, actually following, hanging back just far enough to maintain plausible deniability while clearly tracking her movements. Maya's boxing training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was screaming danger. Instead of walking to her car, she'd turned toward the main building, hoping to find a teacher or administrator still on campus. But the school was largely empty, and Connor had apparently anticipated this move. He'd called out to her, his voice falsely friendly. "Hey Maya, Blake wants to talk to you. He's waiting in the old gym." The old gymnasium had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the school had built a new athletic complex. The building was scheduled for demolition, but budget constraints had delayed the project indefinitely. Students weren't supposed to enter the building, but rules had never applied to Blake Morrison before. Maya's every survival instinct told her to run, to get in her car and drive away, to call her mother or the police or anyone who might help. But Connor had positioned himself between her and the parking lot, and she could see Ryan Torres emerging from the main building behind her. They weren't being subtle about boxing her in. "I don't want to talk to Blake," Maya had said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Come on," Connor had replied, pulling out his phone and showing her the screen. "He's got something that belongs to you." The photo on his phone showed Maya's backpack, the one that had gone missing from her locker that morning. She'd assumed she'd misplaced it somewhere, but apparently Blake had orchestrated another theft. Her laptop was in that bag, along with 3 weeks' worth of homework and her father's watch, the only valuable thing she owned. Maya had followed Connor to the old gym because she'd seen no alternative, but she'd texted her location to her mother as they walked. A small precaution that would prove more important than she realized. The abandoned building felt like a tomb, all shadows and dust and the lingering smell of old sweat and disinfectant. Connor had led her through empty hallways lined with trophy cases displaying the achievements of students who'd graduated years ago. Blake had been waiting in the main gymnasium, along with Ryan and 2 other boys Maya recognized but didn't know well. Her backpack sat on the floor beside him like bait in a trap she'd already walked into. The boys formed a loose circle around the room's exits, not quite blocking them but making their intentions clear. "Maya Chen," Blake had said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Portland's most mysterious student. You know, I've been trying to figure you out for weeks." Maya had focused on her backpack, calculating distances and escape routes the way Jake had taught her. 5 boys, all bigger than her, all probably stronger. But size and strength weren't everything in a fight. Speed mattered more. Technique mattered more. And Maya had been training for this moment her entire life without knowing it. "Can I have my bag back?" she'd asked, proud of how calm she sounded. "Sure," Blake had replied. "But first, I want to understand something. See, I've been watching you, and there's something that doesn't add up. You act like you're afraid of everything, but then you do things like that chemistry lab move. Fast. Controlled. Like you've had training." Maya's heart had begun racing, but she'd kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do." Blake had started circling her slowly, like a shark testing the water. "I think you're not as helpless as you pretend to be. And that makes me curious." Connor had been recording everything on his phone, Maya noticed. Creating evidence of what, she wasn't sure, but the camera's presence made the situation feel even more dangerous. Whatever Blake had planned, he wanted documentation. "So here's what we're going to do," Blake had continued. "We're going to test a theory. Connor here ordered something special online, and we're going to see how you react under pressure." That's when Connor had pulled the taser from his jacket pocket. Military grade, Maya had realized immediately. The kind that could stop a grown man at 20 feet. Not a toy, not a prank device, but a genuine weapon capable of causing serious injury or death if used incorrectly. "Blake," Ryan had said, his voice uncertain, "this is too much, man. We said we were just going to scare her." "She's not scared enough yet," Blake had replied, never taking his eyes off Maya. "Are you, scholarship girl?" Maya had felt the familiar calm descend over her then, the same focused clarity that came during sparring sessions at Steel City. Her heartbeat had slowed, her vision had sharpened, and her body had shifted into the fighting stance Jake had drilled into her thousands of times. She'd stopped looking like prey and started looking like something else entirely. "That's interesting," Blake had said, noticing the change. "Very interesting." He'd nodded to Connor, who'd raised the taser and pointed it directly at Maya's chest. The red laser sight had danced across her father's old jacket, and Maya had known with absolute certainty that they intended to use it. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was assault with a deadly weapon. "Last chance to show us who you really are," Blake had said. Maya had smiled then, the first genuine smile she'd worn at Riverside High in 3 years. Because Blake Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. He'd brought a taser to a fight with someone who'd been training to hurt people with her bare hands for 8 months. "Okay," Maya had said quietly. "You want to see who I really am?" That's when Connor had pulled the trigger, sending 50,000 volts of electricity arcing across the abandoned gymnasium toward a girl who was already moving faster than any of them had thought possible. The electricity never found its target. But Maya Chen found hers. Maya moved like water flowing around stone, her body dropping into a crouch as the taser's prongs sailed over her head and embedded themselves in the gymnasium's far wall. The 50,000 volts meant for her chest discharged harmlessly into concrete and dust, sending sparks cascading toward the floor in a brilliant display that illuminated her face for a split second. In that moment of electric light, Connor Davis saw something in her eyes that made his blood freeze. Not fear, not panic, recognition. She'd been expecting this. Maya's counterattack came faster than thought, muscle memory taking over where conscious decision-making would have been too slow. Jake Sullivan had drilled defensive responses into her neural pathways until they became instinct, and now those months of training unfolded in real time. She closed the distance to Connor in 3 fluid steps, her left hand deflecting his shocked attempt to reload the taser, while her right drove upward in a precise uppercut that caught him perfectly under the jaw. Connor's head snapped back with an audible crack, his expensive sneakers leaving the ground as the force of Maya's punch lifted him clean off his feet. He crashed into the trophy case behind him, decades of Riverside High athletic achievements exploding in a shower of glass and twisted metal. The taser skittered across the floor, its laser sight painting wild red patterns on the gymnasium walls as it spun. The entire sequence had taken maybe 4 seconds. Connor lay motionless among the debris, blood trickling from his mouth, his eyes rolled back to show only whites. The other boys stared in stunned silence, their brains struggling to process what they just witnessed. This was Maya Chen, the quiet girl who sat alone at lunch, who never raised her hand in class, who practically vanished into the walls when anyone looked at her too directly. Except she wasn't vanishing now. She stood in the center of the gymnasium like she owned it, balanced on the balls of her feet, hands raised in a perfect fighting stance that spoke of serious training and serious intent. The shy mask had fallen away completely, revealing something underneath that none of them had anticipated. "Holy shit," whispered one of Blake's hangers-on, a football player named Marcus, whose main qualification for inclusion in the group was his willingness to laugh at Blake's jokes and intimidate smaller students on command. She just knocked Connor out cold. Blake himself seemed frozen, his mouth hanging open as he stared at his unconscious friend. The plan had been simple: corner the weird girl, scare her with the taser, maybe rough her up a little to establish dominance, film it all for social media humiliation later. Standard operating procedure for dealing with students who didn't know their place in Riverside High's carefully maintained hierarchy. This was not standard anything. "Ryan," Blake said slowly, never taking his eyes off Maya, "go check on Connor." Ryan Torres hadn't moved since Maya's punch landed. He stood pressed against the gymnasium's double doors like he was trying to melt through them, his face pale and his hands shaking. Of all Blake's followers, Ryan had always been the most reluctant participant in their campaigns of harassment. His family's financial struggles made him dependent on Blake's friendship for social status, but he'd never enjoyed the cruelty that seemed to energize the others. Now he looked like he might vomit. "Ryan," Blake repeated, his voice sharper. "I said check on Connor." "He's breathing," Maya said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Unconscious, but breathing." The punch was calculated for knockout, not murder. Though if you're thinking about calling an ambulance, you might want to consider how you'll explain why Connor was pointing a military-grade taser at an unarmed student. Blake's jaw tightened. The casual way Maya discussed the technical aspects of her attack was almost more unsettling than the attack itself. This wasn't the result of panic or lucky reflexes. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and exactly how much damage she'd chosen to inflict. "You're going to regret this," Blake said, trying to inject his usual authority into his voice and failing. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him with the kind of focused attention a predator might give potential prey. "Blake Morrison, 17 years old, son of Daniel Morrison, owner of Morrison Construction. Your father sits on the school board, donates heavily to the athletic department, and probably has half the city council in his pocket. You drive a BMW that costs more than most people's annual salary, you've never faced real consequences for anything in your life, and you genuinely believe that your family's money makes you untouchable." The accuracy of her assessment sent a chill down Blake's spine. She'd clearly been studying him, learning about his background and his family's influence. But why? When had the shy girl started paying attention to anything beyond her books and her invisibility routine? "You forgot something, though," Maya continued, taking a small step forward that made all 4 remaining boys instinctively step back. "You forgot to research me." "What's to research?" Blake shot back, grasping for his usual confidence. "You're nobody. Scholarship kid from nowhere, living above some convenience store with your nurse mother. No father, no money, no connections, no power. You're exactly the kind of person who disappears without anyone caring." Maya's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You're right about most of that. I am a scholarship student. My mother does work double shifts to keep us afloat. My father is dead, killed in a construction accident when I was 14. We don't have money or political connections or social influence." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "But you made one critical error in your assessment, Blake. You assumed that power only comes from money and status. You never considered that it might come from somewhere else entirely." Marcus, the football player, had been edging toward the fallen Taser while Maya spoke. His hand was maybe 2 feet from the weapon when she noticed his movement. Her response was immediate and decisive. She moved laterally in a perfect boxer's sidestep, snatched the Taser from the floor, and had it pointed at Marcus's chest before he could blink. "I wouldn't," she said conversationally. "This thing is set to a voltage level that could stop your heart if you have any underlying cardiac conditions. And since you play football, there's a decent chance you've had undiagnosed concussions that could make the effects unpredictable." Marcus froze, his hands raised in surrender. "Jesus, Maya. We weren't really going to hurt you. It was just supposed to be a prank." "A prank?" Maya repeated, her voice flat. "You brought a weapon capable of causing cardiac arrest to threaten an isolated student in an abandoned building, and you're calling it a prank." She gestured toward Connor, who was starting to stir among the broken glass. "Tell me, Marcus, at what point does a prank become assault with a deadly weapon? When the victim ends up in the hospital? When they die? Or when the local news starts asking questions about why Riverside High's star students are walking around with military hardware?" The mention of news coverage made Blake's face go white. His father had built Morrison Construction's reputation on community involvement and family values. A scandal involving his son and a Taser would destroy years of carefully cultivated public image. Worse, it would raise questions about how Blake had acquired such a weapon in the first place, Questions that might lead investigators to Connor's online purchase history and the credit card that had funded it. "Look," Blake said, his voice losing its aggressive edge. "This got out of hand. Nobody meant for anyone to get hurt. We can all just walk away from this, pretend it never happened." Maya considered this for a moment, the taser still trained on Marcus's chest. "Walk away. Interesting proposal. Let me make a counteroffer." She pulled out her phone with her free hand, swiping to the camera app. "I'm going to document Connor's injuries and the taser's presence here. Then I'm going to file a police report detailing how 5 male students lured me to an isolated location and threatened me with an electrical weapon. The taser will be evidence, Connor's medical records will corroborate the assault, and your little friend there has been filming everything on his phone." Blake followed her gaze to where Ryan still stood by the doors, his own phone clutched in his trembling hands. Maya had noticed the recording device from the beginning, but instead of seeing it as a threat, she'd recognized it as evidence that would support her version of events. "Ryan's video will show Connor pointing the taser at me, my defensive response, and this entire conversation where you've essentially admitted to orchestrating the whole thing. The timestamp will prove premeditation, and the location will demonstrate that this was an isolated attack designed to avoid witnesses." Maya's smile grew wider as she watched the implications sink in. But here's the really interesting part. Once this becomes a police matter, investigators will want to know how high school students acquired military-grade weapons. They'll examine Connor's online purchase history, his credit card records, his shipping addresses. They'll interview his parents, your parents, school administrators. Blake was beginning to sweat despite the gymnasium's chill. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand something very clearly," Maya said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You picked the wrong target. You thought you were hunting sheep, but you found a wolf instead. And wolves, don't forget." Connor groaned and tried to sit up, one hand pressed to his bleeding mouth. His eyes struggled to focus, but when they found Maya standing over him with a taser, he scrambled backward so quickly he cut his hands on the broken glass. "She's insane," he slurred through swollen lips. "Blake, she's completely insane." "No," Maya replied calmly. "I'm trained. There's a difference, though I understand how you might confuse the two." She powered down the taser and set it carefully on the floor, well out of everyone's reach. "Here's what's going to happen. Connor is going to need medical attention for his mouth and possible concussion. You're going to tell the emergency room staff that he fell during a pickup basketball game. No mention of tasers, no mention of fights, no mention of me." "And if we don't?" Blake asked. Maya pulled out her phone again, this time opening a text message thread. "Then I send this video to Channel 8 News, the Portland Tribune, and every social media platform I can think of. The headline will be something like 'Wealthy Students Attack Scholarship Girl with Military Weapon.' Your father's construction business will be front-page news by tomorrow morning." Blake stared at the phone screen, watching his entire future crumble in real time. Yale wouldn't accept a student with a pending assault charge. Morrison, construction couldn't survive the public relations nightmare. His father would destroy him if he brought that kind of attention to the family business. "This isn't over," he said weakly. Maya's laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, Blake, you still don't understand. It is over. You just don't realize how completely yet." She walked toward the gymnasium doors, pausing when she reached Ryan. The boy was still recording, his phone shaking in his hands as he tried to process what he'd witnessed. "Turn it off," Maya said gently. Ryan fumbled with his phone, ending the recording with obvious relief. Maya studied his face for a moment, seeing the guilt and fear warring behind his eyes. "You didn't want to be here tonight," she observed. Ryan shook his head mutely. "Then don't be here for whatever comes next," Maya advised. "Blake's going to escalate this because boys like him always do when their power gets challenged. When that happens, you can choose whether you're going to be part of the problem or part of the solution." She pushed past him and walked out of the gymnasium, leaving 5 boys to contemplate the wreckage of their evening and their assumptions about power dynamics at Riverside High School. Behind her, she could hear Blake cursing and Connor whimpering about his injuries, but she didn't look back. Maya retrieved her backpack from where Blake had left it and walked calmly to her car. Her hands were steady as she started the engine, though she noticed her heartbeat hadn't returned to normal yet. The adrenaline from her first real fight outside the gym was still coursing through her system, making colors seem brighter and sounds more distinct. She'd known this confrontation was coming for weeks. Blake's harassment had been building towards something, and Maya had been preparing for it without consciously admitting her preparations to herself. The extra training sessions at Steel City, the research into her tormentors' backgrounds, the careful documentation of each incident of harassment, she'd been gathering intelligence and building skills like a soldier preparing for war. Tonight had been the opening battle, and she'd won decisively, but Maya understood warfare better than Blake gave her credit for. Winning the first engagement didn't mean winning the conflict. If anything, humiliating Blake so completely had probably guaranteed that he would escalate his response. Maya drove home through Portland's rain-slicked streets, her mind already calculating her next moves. She had evidence now, documentation that could destroy Blake's future if he pushed too hard. But she also had something more valuable. She'd shattered his image of her as a helpless victim. Blake Morrison was about to learn that there were different kinds of power in the world, and that underestimating your opponent was the fastest way to lose everything you thought you controlled. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Working late tonight. Leftover soup in fridge. Love you." Maya smiled and typed back, "Love you too, Mom. Everything's fine." It was the first time in months that statement had been completely true. Everything was fine. Better than fine, actually. For the first time since starting at Riverside High, Maya Chen felt like herself again. Not the shy girl hiding in corners, not the invisible student avoiding confrontation, but the fighter Jake Sullivan had been training, the survivor her father had raised, the young woman her mother deserved as a daughter. Blake Morrison had wanted to see who she really was. Tomorrow he'd start learning exactly what that meant. Maya parked behind Chen's Corner Market and climbed the narrow stairs to their apartment above the store. The familiar smells of ginger and star anise from the restaurant next door greeted her, along with the comforting silence of home. She hung her father's jacket in the closet, noting the small tear in the sleeve from her encounter with the broken glass. She'd need to repair it before her mother noticed. In her room, Maya opened her laptop and began typing a detailed account of the evening's events. She documented everything: the fake invitation to meet Blake, the presence of the taser, Connor's assault, her defensive response, and the subsequent conversation. She included timestamps, descriptions of injuries, and a complete list of witnesses present. Then she uploaded Ryan's video footage to 3 separate cloud storage accounts, created encrypted backups, and sent copies to 2 trusted email addresses she'd established for exactly this purpose. If Blake thought he could make the evidence disappear through intimidation or his father's influence, he was about to discover how thoroughly modern teenagers understood digital preservation. Maya's final task was to send a carefully worded email to Jake Sullivan, her boxing trainer. She didn't provide details about the confrontation, but she let him know that she'd been forced to use her training in self-defense and that she might need guidance on next steps. Jake had been in enough fights, both professional and personal, to understand the psychological aftermath of violence. He'd know what advice to offer. As she prepared for bed, Maya caught sight of herself in the mirror and paused. The shy girl who'd entered the abandoned gymnasium a few hours earlier was gone, replaced by someone who looked older, more confident, more dangerous. Her shoulders were straighter, her gaze more direct, her entire posture radiating the kind of quiet authority that came from knowing you could handle whatever the world threw at you. She thought about Blake's final words. This isn't over. He was right about that, but not in the way he imagined. This wasn't over because Maya wasn't going to let it be over. She'd spent 3 years being invisible, enduring harassment, accepting her place at the bottom of Riverside High's social hierarchy. That version of herself had died tonight in the abandoned gymnasium, struck down by 50,000 volts of electricity that never found their target. What had emerged from that death was something Blake Morrison wasn't prepared to face. A girl who knew exactly how much damage she could inflict and exactly how far she was willing to go to protect herself and others. Maya had tasted victory tonight, and she'd discovered that she liked it. She fell asleep easily for the first time in months, her dreams filled not with anxiety and helplessness, but with combinations and footwork and the satisfying sound of Connor Davis hitting the floor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new confrontations, new opportunities to prove that power didn't always flow from money and status. Tomorrow, Chen would begin teaching Riverside High a lesson about underestimating the quiet ones. The whispers started before Maya even reached her locker Monday morning. Students clustered in hallways, their conversations dying as she passed, then resuming in urgent undertones once they thought she was out of earshot. Word had spread through Riverside High's social networks with the viral intensity that only teenage gossip could achieve, though the details had been distorted beyond recognition through multiple retellings. Some versions had Maya hospitalized. Others claimed Connor Davis had been arrested. The most dramatic accounts suggested that Blake Morrison had been expelled and his father's company was under federal investigation. But the common thread running through every story was that the quiet scholarship girl had somehow brought down Blake's crew in spectacular fashion, and nobody quite knew how or why. Maya navigated the attention with the same calm precision she'd used to dismantle Connor's assault. She kept her expression neutral, her movements controlled, her responses to direct questions politely non-committal. Let them wonder, let them speculate. Uncertainty was a weapon she could wield more effectively than any taser. Blake was absent from first-period AP Literature, his usual front-row seat conspicuously empty. Connor appeared briefly in the hallway between classes, sporting a swollen jaw and moving with the careful gait of someone nursing hidden injuries. But he disappeared again before lunch. Ryan Torres sat alone at a corner table in the cafeteria, picking at his food and avoiding eye contact with everyone who passed. The power vacuum Blake's absence created was immediately noticeable. Students who normally arranged their entire schedules around avoiding his crew suddenly moved through the hallways with less tension. Conversations happened more freely. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if someone had opened windows in a room that had been sealed for too long. Maya ate her lunch in the library, same as always, but she noticed the difference in how other students looked at her. The careful invisibility she'd cultivated for 3 years had been shattered permanently. Some gazes held fear, others curiosity, a few showed something approaching respect. None of them looked through her anymore as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to occupy space. It was during 5th period chemistry that the first real test came. Maya was working alone at her lab station, titrating a weak acid solution, when she became aware of someone standing too close behind her. She turned to find Chen, the football player who'd tried to grab the taser, looming over her with his usual intimidating bulk. "We need to talk," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to be heard over the general classroom noise, but not quite loud enough to attract Mr. Peterson's attention from across the room. Maya didn't stop working, continuing to add drops of sodium hydroxide to her solution while watching the color change indicator. "Do we? Blake wants a meeting. Tonight." "Neutral ground." "Blake can want whatever he likes," Maya replied, noting the precise moment her solution shifted from clear to pale pink. "That doesn't obligate me to provide it." Marcus moved closer, using his size to create an implicit threat. It was basic dominance posturing, the kind of physical intimidation that probably worked on most of Riverside's student body. Maya had been expecting it. "This doesn't have to get uglier than it already has," Marcus continued. "Blake's willing to call it even. What happened Friday was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. Everyone walks away. No hard feelings. No consequences." Maya finally looked up from her titration, meeting Marcus's eyes with the kind of direct stare that made him unconsciously step backward. "And if I decline this generous offer? Then things get complicated for you and your family. Blake's father has a lot of influence in this town. Your mom works at Portland General, right? Hospital administration boards can be very sensitive about employee family members who attract negative attention." The threat was clumsy and obvious, exactly the kind of leverage Blake would think to use. Threaten the family member, force compliance through fear of economic retaliation. It might have worked on the old Maya, the invisible girl who believed her mother's job security was more important than her own dignity. But that girl had died Friday night in an abandoned gymnasium. "Tell Blake I'll meet with him," Maya said calmly, returning to her lab work. "Tomorrow after school. The main gymnasium, not the abandoned one. Public space, multiple witnesses, security cameras." Marcus looked surprised. He'd clearly expected more resistance to Blake's demands. "You'll call off whatever you're planning? No police, no media, no revenge plots?" Maya's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. I'll discuss his proposal. That's all I'm promising. After Marcus left, Maya finished her titration with steady hands, recorded her results with meticulous precision, and began planning Blake Morrison's complete destruction. He'd made the classic mistake of believing that because she'd agreed to negotiate, she was operating from a position of weakness. In reality, Maya was about to demonstrate exactly how thoroughly she'd been preparing for this conflict. That afternoon, instead of heading directly to Steel City Boxing, Maya made a detour to the Portland Public Library's downtown branch. She needed resources that her phone couldn't provide, databases that required institutional access, archives that weren't available through casual internet searches. The reference librarian, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, helped Maya navigate the municipal record system and the local newspaper morgue with the efficiency of someone who understood that knowledge was power. What Maya discovered in those archives would have made Blake physically ill if he'd known she was looking. Morrison Construction's public record was impressive. Charity donations, community projects, civic leadership awards. But deeper investigation revealed a more complex picture. 3 different lawsuits alleging workplace safety violations had been settled out of court in the past 5 years. 2 former employees had filed complaints with the Department of Labor that had been quietly withdrawn after receiving undisclosed financial settlements. Most interesting was a city council vote from 18 months earlier regarding a controversial development project in southeast Portland. Morrison Construction had received the contract despite submitting a bid that was significantly higher than 2 competing companies. The meeting minutes showed that Daniel Morrison had made substantial campaign contributions to 3 of the 5 council members who voted in his favor. Maya photographed everything, building a comprehensive file on the Morrison family's business practices and political influence. If Blake wanted to threaten her mother's job, she would be prepared to threaten his father's reputation and potentially his freedom. Corporate corruption investigations could destroy companies overnight, especially when federal prosecutors were involved. Her research also uncovered something more immediately useful. Morrison Construction was currently working on a high-profile renovation of Portland's historic courthouse. The project had been plagued with delays and cost overruns, making Daniel Morrison vulnerable to public criticism. Any scandal involving his son would inevitably reflect on his professional competence and could jeopardize his company's relationship with the city. Armed with this ammunition, Maya finally headed to Steel City Boxing. Jake Sullivan was waiting for her in the gym's office, a cramped space above the main training floor that smelled like leather and liniment. He'd clearly been expecting her since receiving her email, and his expression suggested he understood more about her situation than she'd explicitly revealed. So, Jake said without preamble, you had to use what I taught you. Maya nodded, settling into the folding chair across from his desk. Self-defense. 5 against 1, they had a weapon. Cops involved? Not yet. The other side wants to negotiate. Jake leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of professional assessment he usually reserved for evaluating fighters before matches. You hurt anyone bad? 1 knockout, clean and controlled, no permanent damage. Good. That means you kept your head when the adrenaline hit. Jake's approval was evident in his voice. Most people, first real fight, they either freeze up or go completely savage. You did neither. Maya had been worried about Jake's reaction to her using his training outside the gym. Boxing was supposed to be about discipline, self-control, channeling aggression into productive outlets. But Jake understood violence in ways that most people never would, and he recognized the difference between aggression and self-preservation. What kind of negotiation are they talking about? Jake asked. Maya explained Blake's offer. Mutual amnesty, no consequences, everyone walks away. Jake listened without interruption, his expression growing more skeptical with each detail. Kid, he said finally, that's not a negotiation, that's a surrender demand. They're betting you'll be scared enough of escalation to take the deal and disappear. I know, and you're not taking it. It wasn't a question. Jake had been training Maya long enough to recognize the look in her eyes. She'd moved past fear into something more dangerous. Calculated determination. They threatened my mother's job, Maya said simply. Jake nodded as if this explained everything, which it did. He'd grown up in neighborhoods where family threats were crossing a line that justified any response. What do you need from me? Advice. I'm going to destroy them, but I want to do it right. Clean, legal, permanent. Jake was quiet for several minutes, thinking through options and consequences. Finally, he pulled a business card from his desk drawer and slid it across to Maya. Detective Sarah Martinez, Portland PD. She handles cases involving minors and weapons charges. Good cop, honest, doesn't play politics with rich families. If you decide to make this official, she's the one you want handling it. Maya pocketed the card. And if I don't go official? Then you better be absolutely sure you can control the outcome. Rich kids like Blake, when they get cornered, they don't go down quietly. They have resources you don't, connections you can't match. If you're going to war with them, you better win decisively the first time, because you won't get a second chance. Maya spent the next hour training with unusual intensity, working through combinations and defensive sequences while her mind processed strategy and tactics. Jake put her through sparring rounds with 2 different partners, both older and more experienced, testing her ability to maintain focus under pressure. She moved with fluid precision, landing clean shots while avoiding retaliation, demonstrating that Friday night's confrontation hadn't shaken her confidence or technique. "You're different," observed Sarah Kim, one of the gym's regular fighters who'd been Maya's sparring partner. "Sharper, more aggressive." Maya toweled off sweat and considered this assessment. Sarah was right. Something fundamental had changed during the confrontation with Blake's crew. The defensive mindset that had characterized her first months of training had evolved into something more proactive. She wasn't just learning to protect herself anymore. She was learning to win. "Sometimes situations require adaptation," Maya replied. That evening, Maya sat at her kitchen table working through calculus problems, while her mother ate a late dinner between hospital shifts. Maria looked exhausted, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from 14 hours of patient care, but she still insisted on checking Maya's homework and asking about her day. "Everything good at school, Mija? You seem different lately, more confident." Maya looked up from her derivatives, studying her mother's tired face. Maria worked so hard to provide for them, sacrificing her own comfort and health to ensure Maya had opportunities for a better future. The idea that Blake Morrison might jeopardize her mother's job security made Maya's jaw clench with barely controlled fury. "School's fine, Mom. Just feeling more like myself lately." "Good. Your father always said you had fire inside you, but it took time to find the right way to let it out." Maria squeezed Maya's shoulder affectionately. "I'm proud of who you're becoming." If only she knew, Maya thought. If only she knew that her quiet, studious daughter was planning to dismantle the life of one of Portland's most prominent families. That the girl who never caused trouble was about to create enough trouble to reshape Riverside High's entire social hierarchy. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Tomorrow, 4 p.m. main gym. Come alone. Time to end this like adults. Blake." Maya smiled and typed back, "See you there." But Blake Morrison had no idea what kind of adult he was about to face. Maya spent the rest of the evening finalizing her preparations, organizing her evidence, and planning her opening moves for tomorrow's confrontation. She had documentation of criminal assault, evidence of systematic harassment, and enough dirt on Blake's family business to bury them in scandal for years. More importantly, she had something Blake had never possessed and couldn't understand: the absolute certainty that came from being completely in the right. Maya wasn't just fighting for her own dignity anymore. She was fighting for every student who'd been victimized by wealthy bullies, who believed their money made them untouchable. She was fighting for her mother's security and her father's memory and her own future. Blake wanted to end this like adults. Maya was going to show him what that actually meant. Tomorrow afternoon, in front of witnesses and security cameras, she would demonstrate the difference between power derived from privilege and power earned through sacrifice and preparation. The shy girl was truly dead now, replaced by someone who understood that justice sometimes required you to stop being nice and start being effective. Blake Morrison was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible, and Maya Chen was going to enjoy teaching it to him. She fell asleep that night with a clear conscience and a detailed battle plan, ready to wage war on behalf of everyone who'd ever been told they didn't matter. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end for Blake Morrison's reign of terror, and Maya could hardly wait to watch his empire crumble. The main gymnasium at Riverside High buzzed with activity Tuesday afternoon as basketball practice wound down and various after-school clubs began setting up for their meetings. Maya arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, her timing calculated to ensure maximum witness presence without making her intentions obvious. She carried her usual backpack and wore her father's construction jacket, the small tear in the sleeve now expertly mended with thread that matched so perfectly her mother would never notice the repair. Blake Morrison waited near the center court line, flanked by Connor Davis and Marcus Chen. Connor's face still showed evidence of their Friday night encounter, purple bruising along his jawline and a slight swelling that affected his speech. He kept touching his mouth gingerly, as if checking that his teeth were still properly aligned. Marcus stood with his arms crossed, radiating the kind of barely controlled hostility that suggested he was hoping this meeting would escalate to violence. Notably absent was Ryan Torres, whose conspicuous non-participation Maya filed away as potentially significant intelligence. Either Blake had decided Ryan was unreliable after witnessing his reluctance Friday night, or Ryan had made the conscious choice to distance himself from whatever Blake was planning. Both possibilities suggested cracks in Blake's support structure that Maya could potentially exploit. Several other students lingered in the gymnasium's vicinity, ostensibly engaged in legitimate activities but clearly curious about the gathering storm. Maya recognized Ashley Williams from student council setting up folding chairs for some kind of meeting, her movements deliberately slow as she positioned herself within listening distance. Two members of the debate team occupied a corner table, their textbooks open, but their attention focused entirely on the brewing confrontation. Most importantly, Maya spotted the security cameras positioned throughout the gymnasium, their red recording lights blinking steadily. Whatever happened here would be documented from multiple angles, creating an official record that couldn't be disputed or manipulated later. Blake had chosen this location thinking it would provide neutral ground, but he'd actually handed Maya a significant tactical advantage. "You came," Blake said as Maya approached, his voice carrying a note of surprise that suggested he'd genuinely expected her to avoid this confrontation. "You asked for a meeting," Maya replied calmly. "I'm curious to hear what you think we need to discuss." Blake's confidence seemed to return as he fell into familiar patterns of social dominance. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and adopted the casual arrogance that had served him well throughout his privileged life. "What we need to discuss is how you're going to fix the mess you created Friday night." Maya tilted her head slightly, genuinely puzzled by his perspective. "The mess I created? You mean the mess where your friend pointed a military-grade taser at my chest and threatened to electrocute me?" "That was a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion," Connor interjected, his words slightly slurred by his injured jaw. "Nobody was actually going to hurt you." "Really?" Maya pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her photo gallery. "Because I have some interesting documentation about the weapon you used. Did you know that civilian possession of law enforcement-grade tasers requires special permits in Oregon? And that threatening someone with such a device constitutes assault with a deadly weapon, regardless of your intentions?" The color drained from Connor's face as he realized the legal implications of his actions. Blake shot him a sharp look that clearly communicated his frustration with his friend's inability to think beyond immediate gratification. "You're not going to the police," Blake said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Because if you do, everyone's going to find out about your little violent outburst. Self-defense is one thing, but what you did to Connor was assault. You could face criminal charges yourself." Maya's smile was patient, almost condescending. "Blake, do you understand how self-defense laws actually work in Oregon? Or are you just hoping I don't?" She gestured toward the security cameras positioned around the gymnasium. "Oregon is a stand-your-ground state. If someone threatens you with a deadly weapon, you have the legal right to respond, with whatever force is necessary to neutralize that threat." Connor pointed a taser at my chest. I responded proportionally to eliminate the danger he posed. Blake's jaw tightened as he realized his legal intimidation tactic was backfiring. He'd clearly consulted with someone about potential charges Maya might face, but he'd received incomplete or deliberately misleading information. Maya, meanwhile, had spent Monday evening researching Oregon's self-defense statutes with the thoroughness of a law student preparing for final exams. "Besides," Maya continued conversationally, "even if I were vulnerable to criminal charges, which I'm not, You'd have to be willing to file a police report acknowledging that your crew threatened me with illegal weapons in an abandoned building. Are you prepared to have that conversation with Detective Martinez at Portland PD? The mention of a specific detective's name sent another wave of concern across Blake's face. Maya had dropped Jake's contact deliberately, wanting Blake to understand that she wasn't an isolated teenager stumbling through this conflict without adult guidance. She had resources, connections, and a clear understanding of her legal position. "Look," Marcus said, stepping forward in an obvious attempt to de-escalate the tension. "This doesn't have to be complicated. Blake's offering you a clean slate. What happened Friday stays between us. Nobody files any reports. Everybody moves on with their lives." "And in exchange for this generous amnesty," Maya asked, "what exactly would you require from me?" Blake's mask of reasonable negotiation finally slipped, revealing the entitled fury underneath. "You shut your mouth, you stop spreading stories, and you remember your place in this school's hierarchy. You're a scholarship kid from nowhere, and you don't get to embarrass your betters without consequences." There it was. The fundamental truth underlying everything Blake Morrison had done since Maya first refused to acknowledge his authority. This wasn't about Friday night's confrontation or even about his wounded pride. This was about a worldview that placed him inherently above people like Maya simply by virtue of his family's wealth and social position. Maya had been hoping he would reveal this attitude so explicitly, and Blake had obliged her perfectly. His words were exactly the kind of privileged arrogance that would play disastrously in any public forum, whether that was a school disciplinary hearing, a courtroom, or the local news media. "Your betters," Maya repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting phrase. Tell me, Blake, what exactly makes you my better? Your family's money? Your father's political connections? Your ability to purchase military weapons for intimidating classmates?" "My family built this town," Blake shot back, his voice rising with indignation. "We employ half the people in Portland. We donate millions to local charities. We've been pillars of this community for generations. What has your family contributed? What have you ever contributed?" Maya's expression remained perfectly calm, but internally she was celebrating. Blake was providing her with exactly the kind of inflammatory statements that would destroy him in any public relations battle. His sense of superiority was so ingrained that he couldn't help expressing it even when doing so clearly damaged his position. "My father contributed his life, building the infrastructure that supports your family's construction business," Maya said quietly. "He died in an industrial accident caused by inadequate safety protocols, the kind of cost-cutting measures that prioritize profit over worker protection." This was true, though Maya had never previously connected her father's death to the broader pattern of corporate negligence that characterized Portland's construction industry. Her Monday afternoon research had revealed more than information about Morrison Construction specifically. It had illuminated an entire network of companies that systematically exploited workers while enriching owners and shareholders. Blake looked genuinely surprised by this revelation, suggesting he'd never bothered to research Maya's background as thoroughly as she'd researched his. "I didn't know about your father. But that has nothing to do with Morrison Construction. We have excellent safety records." "Do you?" Maya pulled out her phone again, this time accessing the photo she'd taken at the library. "Because I found some interesting information about workplace safety violations and out-of-court settlements involving your father's company. Would you like me to read the details?" The blood drained from Blake's face as he realized Maya had been conducting opposition research on his family. Connor and Marcus exchanged worried glances, clearly understanding that this confrontation was spiraling beyond their ability to control. "You've been investigating my family?" Blake demanded. "I've been educating myself about the people who threaten me," Maya corrected. "And I discovered some fascinating patterns. For instance, did you know that Morrison Construction has settled 3 different lawsuits alleging safety violations in the past 5 years? The settlements included non-disclosure agreements, which is why the information isn't widely known." Blake's hands clenched into fists as he struggled to maintain his composure. "Those settlements don't admit any wrongdoing, they're just business decisions to avoid litigation costs." "Perhaps, but they do suggest a pattern of prioritizing profits over worker safety. Combined with your personal use of illegal weapons to intimidate students, they paint an interesting picture of Morrison family values." Maya paused, letting the implication sink in before delivering her next revelation. Speaking of interesting patterns, I also researched the city council vote that awarded your father the courthouse renovation contract. Fascinating how campaign contributions align with voting patterns, don't you think? Blake's face had gone white with fury and fear. Maya was systematically dismantling not just his personal position, but his entire family's reputation and business interests. The scope of her research demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that he'd completely underestimated. "What do you want?" he asked through gritted teeth. Maya smiled, recognizing that Blake had finally understood the true dynamics of their confrontation. "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because I'm only going to say this once." She stepped closer, close enough that her voice wouldn't carry to the other students scattered around the gymnasium, but loud enough for Blake's crew to hear every word. "You are going to stop harassing me. You are going to stop harassing any other student at this school. You are going to instruct your friends to follow the same policy. And you are going to hope very fervently that I don't decide to share my research with the Portland Tribune's investigative journalism team." Blake's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he processed the complete reversal of their power dynamic. 3 days ago, he'd been the predator, and Maya had been helpless prey. Now she held enough ammunition to destroy his family's business and his father's political career, and she was dictating terms with the calm authority of someone who held all the advantages. "You can't prove any of those allegations," Connor said weakly, but his heart clearly wasn't in the defense. "Actually, I can," Maya replied without taking her eyes off Blake. "Public records, campaign finance reports, court documents, employee testimony. It's all a matter of public record if you know where to look and how to connect the dots." She pulled a flash drive from her pocket and held it up for Blake to see. "Copies of everything, stored in multiple locations, with instructions for release if anything happens to me or my family. Insurance policy." Marcus stepped forward aggressively, clearly considering physical intimidation as a solution to their problem. "Maybe we should just take that drive and end this conversation right now." Maya's stance shifted subtly, her weight moving to the balls of her feet, her hands rising slightly in preparation for defense. The change was so smooth and natural that it took a moment for Blake's crew to recognize what they were seeing: a trained fighter preparing to engage multiple opponents. "Marcus," Maya said pleasantly, "do you really want to assault me in front of security cameras and 20 witnesses? Because I promise you that won't end the way you think it will." Marcus hesitated, remembering Connor's fate Friday night and recognizing that Maya showed no fear whatsoever of his physical threats. Blake grabbed his friend's arm, pulling him back before he could make their situation exponentially worse. "Stand down," Blake ordered, his voice hollow with defeat. Maya relaxed her stance but remained alert. "Smart choice. Now, do we have an understanding about how things are going to work going forward?" Blake stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through rage, humiliation, and finally grudging acceptance. He'd been comprehensively outmaneuvered by someone he'd considered beneath his notice, and they both knew it. "We have an understanding," he said finally. "Excellent. Then I think our business here is concluded." Maya shouldered her backpack and turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something important. "Oh, and Blake? If I were you, I'd have a serious conversation with Connor about his online purchasing habits. Federal authorities get very interested when civilians acquire law enforcement equipment, especially after that equipment is used in criminal assaults. Just some friendly advice." Maya walked away from the confrontation with steady, measured steps, leaving Blake Morrison and his crew to contemplate the wreckage of their assumptions about power and privilege. Behind her, she could hear urgent whispered conversations and what sounded like Connor beginning to panic about potential federal investigation. Ashley Williams caught up with her in the hallway outside the gymnasium, her eyes bright with curiosity and something approaching admiration. "That was incredible," Ashley said quietly. "I've never seen anyone shut Blake down like that." Maya studied the student council president's face, seeing genuine approval rather than the fear or calculation she'd grown accustomed to reading in other students' expressions. "You were listening." Everyone was listening. Blake's voice carries when he gets angry. Ashley smiled conspiratorially. "For what it's worth, you did what a lot of us have wanted to do for years." Blake Morrison needed to learn that his money doesn't make him untouchable. Maya nodded thoughtfully. Ashley's response suggested that Blake's reign of intimidation had created more enemies than allies, and that Maya's victory might inspire others to resist his influence. That could be useful intelligence for future conflicts. "What happens now?" Ashley asked. Maya considered the question seriously. Blake would undoubtedly regroup and attempt some form of retaliation, but his options were severely limited by the evidence Maya possessed. He couldn't escalate to physical violence without risking criminal charges, and he couldn't use his family's influence without exposing them to the scandals Maya had uncovered. Now Blake learns to coexist peacefully with people he previously considered beneath him, Maya said. And everyone else learns that bullies are only powerful until someone refuses to be intimidated. That evening, Maya sat in Steel City Boxing's office reviewing her performance during the confrontation while Jake Sullivan listened with professional attention. She'd recorded the entire conversation on her phone, creating another layer of documentation in case Blake attempted to deny their agreement later. "You handled that perfectly," Jake said after listening to the playback. "Stayed calm, controlled the narrative, demonstrated strength without unnecessary aggression." Textbook psychological warfare. Maya felt a surge of pride at his approval. Jake had been in enough confrontations to recognize tactical excellence when he saw it, and his assessment carried weight that her own self-evaluation couldn't provide. "What about Blake's next move?" Maya asked. "He's not going to accept this defeat quietly." Jake leaned back in his chair, thinking through possibilities. Rich kids like him, when they get cornered this thoroughly, they usually do one of two things. Either they cut their losses and avoid further confrontation, or they escalate beyond reason and destroy themselves. Which do you think Blake will choose? Based on what you've told me about his personality, he's going to escalate. Boys like him can't stand being humiliated, especially by someone they consider inferior. He'll try something desperate and stupid, and when he does, you'll be ready for it. Maya nodded, already planning her defensive measures for Blake's inevitable retaliation attempt. She had documentation, witnesses, legal resources, and most importantly, she had the absolute moral authority that came from being completely in the right. Blake Morrison's empire was crumbling, and Maya Chen was just getting started. Blake Morrison's desperation manifested 3 days later in the form of a plan so reckless and poorly conceived that it bordered on self-destruction. Unable to accept his humiliation or the complete reversal of power dynamics at Riverside High, Blake decided that if he couldn't intimidate Maya directly, he would force her into a position where she had no choice but to submit to his demands. His target was Maria Chen. Thursday evening found Maya's mother walking through the hospital parking garage after a grueling 12-hour shift, her nurse's bag heavy with medical supplies and her mind focused on getting home to prepare dinner for Maya. She'd noticed the unmarked van parked near her Honda Civic but thought nothing of it until Connor Davis and 2 unfamiliar young men emerged from the vehicle and blocked her path. Maria's nursing experience had taught her to recognize dangerous situations quickly, and every instinct she possessed immediately went into high alert. These weren't random criminals looking for money or car theft opportunities. They knew who she was, had deliberately waited for her, and their body language suggested specific intent rather than opportunistic crime. "Mrs. Chen," Connor said, his swollen jaw still affecting his speech, "we need to talk to you about your daughter." Maria's hand moved instinctively toward the panic button on her keychain, but one of the unknown men stepped closer, revealing the outline of what appeared to be a weapon beneath his jacket. Not enough to constitute an obvious threat, but sufficient to communicate that compliance would be preferable to resistance. "Maya's been causing problems at school," Connor continued, seemingly oblivious to the legal implications of what he was orchestrating. "Spreading lies about Blake Morrison and his family. We thought you might want to have a conversation with her about making better choices." What Connor and his hired accomplices didn't know was that Maria Chen had grown up in East Los Angeles before moving to Portland, and her survival instincts had been honed by experiences that made Riverside High's social politics seem like children's games. More importantly, Maya had inherited her mother's quick thinking and had taken precautions that Blake's crew couldn't have anticipated. The tracking app Maya had installed on both their phones after Friday night's incident immediately alerted her when her mother's location remained stationary in the hospital parking garage longer than normal patterns suggested. Maya was halfway through her evening training session at Steel City Boxing when the notification appeared on her screen and her blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. Jake Sullivan took one look at Maya's face and knew that their conflict with Blake Morrison had just escalated beyond teenage harassment into adult criminal territory. "What is it?" "They have my mother," Maya said, her voice deadly calm as she began stripping off her boxing gloves. "Hospital parking garage, 3 of them." Jake was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the police." "No time. They'll be gone before patrol units arrive." Maya grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. "But I need backup." Jake Sullivan had been retired from professional boxing for 8 years, but his instincts remained sharp, and his loyalty to his fighters was absolute. When one of his students faced a genuine threat, especially one that involved family members, he didn't hesitate. "Let's go get your mom." The drive to Portland General took 11 minutes through evening traffic, during which Maya provided Jake with a tactical briefing that would have impressed military strategists. She'd been tracking Connor's movements through social media posts and had identified the 2 additional men as Tyler Brooks and Danny Martinez, both recent graduates from Riverside who worked for Morrison Construction and had previous arrests for minor assault charges. "Hired muscle," Jake observed. "Blake's trying to outsource the intimidation because he can't risk being directly involved." Maya's phone showed her mother's location hadn't moved, which meant the confrontation was still ongoing. Either Maria was being held against her will, or she was handling the situation with the kind of calm competence that had gotten her through nursing school as a single mother. Maya hoped fervently that it was the latter. They found the scene exactly as Maya had predicted. Connor and his accomplices had cornered Maria near her car, using positioning and implied threats to prevent her from leaving, while avoiding actions that would constitute obvious kidnapping. It was sophisticated enough to avoid immediate criminal charges, but clumsy enough that they hadn't noticed Jake's truck pulling into the parking garage. Maya emerged from the passenger side with fluid grace, her movements controlled and purposeful as she approached the group. Connor's back was to her, which gave her the advantage of surprise. She needed to end this confrontation quickly and decisively. "Connor," Maya called out, her voice carrying across the parking garage with crystal clarity. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Connor spun around, his expression cycling through surprise, fear, and resignation, as he realized that his leverage had just become his greatest vulnerability. Behind him, Maria Chen's face lit up with relief and something approaching pride as she watched her daughter approach with the confident stride of someone completely unafraid of the situation. "Maya, stay back," Connor warned, trying to regain control of circumstances that were rapidly spiraling beyond his comprehension. "This doesn't concern you directly." "Threatening my mother doesn't concern me." Maya's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Connor, you've just committed felony intimidation and possibly kidnapping. Do you understand the legal implications of what you've done?" Tyler Brooks, the larger of Blake's hired accomplices, stepped forward with the kind of swagger that suggested he believed physical intimidation would resolve this situation in his favor. "Listen, little girl, this is adult business now. Walk away before you get hurt." Maya's response was immediate and educational. She moved faster than Tyler's eyes could track, her left hand deflecting his reaching arm while her right delivered a precise strike to his solar plexus that dropped him to his knees, gasping for breath and unable to speak. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, and demonstrated exactly why Jake Sullivan considered Maya one of his most naturally gifted students. "Danny," Maya said conversationally, addressing the remaining accomplice without taking her eyes off Connor. "Would you like to join Tyler on the ground? Or would you prefer to walk away while you're still capable of walking?" Danny Martinez had enough street experience to recognize when he was outmatched. Tyler Brooks was twice Maya's size and supposedly had military training, but he was currently curled in a fetal position trying to remember how breathing worked. Danny raised his hands in surrender and began backing toward the parking garage exit. "Smart choice," Maya acknowledged. "Don't let me see you again." Connor found himself alone with Maya, her mother, and Jake Sullivan, whose presence added an entirely new dimension of threat to the situation. Jake looked like exactly what he was, a retired professional fighter who had spent years hurting people for money and wouldn't hesitate to resume that career if circumstances required it. "Mrs. Chen," Maya said gently, "are you injured?" "I'm fine, Mija," Maria replied, though her voice carried the strain of someone who'd been genuinely frightened. "These boys were very polite. They just wanted to discuss your behavior at school." Maya's smile could have frozen molten steel. How thoughtful of them. "Connor, I believe you have something to say to my mother." Connor's remaining courage evaporated as he realized the full scope of his legal exposure. Approaching Maria Chen in a parking garage with hired muscle constituted criminal intimidation at minimum, and possibly attempted kidnapping depending on how aggressive prosecutors wanted to be. Blake Morrison's plan had been doomed from conception, but Connor had been too blinded by loyalty and fear to recognize the obvious flaws. "Mrs. Chen, I apologize," Connor said miserably. "This was a misunderstanding that got out of hand." "No," Maya corrected firmly. "This was a deliberate criminal act orchestrated by Blake Morrison and executed by you. There's no misunderstanding involved." She pulled out her phone and began recording video. "Connor Davis, for the record. Did Blake Morrison instruct you to threaten my mother as retaliation for my refusal to be intimidated by your crew?" Connor's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he realized Maya was creating evidence that would destroy not just him, but Blake as well. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to remain silent, but the weight of potential criminal charges made honesty seem like his only viable option. "Blake said your mom needed to understand the consequences of your actions," Connor admitted. "He said if we could make her worried about her job security and her safety, you'd back down from whatever you were planning." Maya nodded thoughtfully, continuing to record. "And did Blake provide you with Tyler Brooks and Danny Martinez to help with this intimidation?" "They work for his dad's company. Blake called them in as backup." The confession was everything Maya needed to destroy Blake Morrison completely. He'd crossed the line from teenage harassment into adult criminal conspiracy, involving family members, and hired accomplices in what amounted to organized stalking and intimidation. No amount of money or political influence could protect him from the legal consequences of threatening a hospital employee in connection with workplace retaliation. "Thank you for your honesty, Connor," Maya said, ending the recording. "I'm sure the district attorney will find your testimony very helpful." Connor's face went white as he finally understood the magnitude of his situation. "Maya, please. Blake's going crazy. He's not thinking straight. He keeps talking about how you're destroying everything he's worked for." "Blake destroyed himself," Maya replied without sympathy. "I just documented the process." Jake Sullivan stepped forward, his presence adding physical weight to Maya's psychological dominance. "Son, you need to understand something very clearly. This family is under my protection now. If Blake or anyone else comes near Mrs. Chen or her daughter again, they'll be dealing with me directly. Are we clear?" Connor nodded frantically, recognizing that Jake Sullivan represented a level of physical threat that Blake's money couldn't neutralize. "Crystal clear, sir." The confrontation ended with Connor fleeing the parking garage while Tyler Brooks remained on the ground, still struggling to breathe normally. Danny Martinez had vanished entirely, probably already planning his resignation from Morrison Construction. Maya helped her mother to her car, while Jake called Detective Martinez to report the incident and provide her with Connor's recorded confession. The next morning brought consequences that Blake Morrison couldn't have anticipated in his wildest nightmares. Connor's confession, combined with Maya's documentation of Blake's harassment campaign and the Morrison family's business corruption, created a perfect storm of legal and public relations disasters that consumed Blake's entire world within hours. Detective Martinez arrived at Riverside High during second period with a warrant for Blake's arrest on charges of criminal conspiracy, intimidation, and harassment. The sight of Portland's golden boy being led away in handcuffs created a sensation that spread through social media faster than wildfire. By lunchtime, video of Blake's arrest had been viewed over 50,000 times on various platforms. The Morrison family's legal troubles multiplied exponentially when federal investigators used Blake's criminal case as justification for examining Morrison Construction's business practices. Maya's research had provided them with specific targets for investigation, and what they discovered validated every allegation she'd uncovered. Daniel Morrison found himself facing charges for tax evasion, campaign finance violations, and workplace safety negligence that carried potential prison sentences longer than his son's entire lifetime. Connor Davis, facing his own criminal charges and the complete collapse of his future prospects, agreed to cooperate fully with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentencing. His testimony provided authorities with detailed evidence of Blake's harassment campaign and his father's business corruption, ensuring that the Morrison family's legal nightmare would continue for years. Maya watched these developments unfold with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning had achieved exactly its intended results. Blake Morrison had been neutralized as a threat, his family's corruption had been exposed, and the systems that had protected wealthy bullies at Riverside High had been permanently dismantled. The transformation in Riverside's social atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Students who had lived in fear of Blake's crew for years began speaking openly about their experiences. The administration, facing potential liability for failing to address harassment complaints, implemented new policies that actually protected vulnerable students rather than enabling their tormentors. Maya herself found that her victory had earned her something she'd never sought: genuine respect from her classmates and teachers. Not the kind of fearful deference that Blake had demanded, but the acknowledgement that came from standing up for principles when doing so required real courage. 3 weeks after Blake's arrest, Maya received acceptance letters from MIT, Stanford, and Caltech, all offering full scholarships that would allow her to pursue engineering degrees without burdening her mother with financial stress. The recommendation letters from her teachers spoke of not just academic excellence, but character, leadership, and the kind of moral courage that universities valued in their students. On graduation day, Maya delivered the valedictorian speech to a packed auditorium that included her mother, Jake Sullivan, Detective Martinez, and dozens of students whose lives had been improved by her refusal to accept injustice. Her speech focused on the power that came from refusing to be a victim, the responsibility that accompanied privilege, and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. Blake Morrison watched the ceremony from a juvenile detention facility, serving the first months of a sentence that would follow him for the rest of his life. His father's construction company had been dissolved amid criminal investigations, his family's political influence had evaporated, and his own future had been reduced to hoping for early parole and a chance to rebuild from nothing. Maya Chen began her freshman year at MIT that fall, studying mechanical engineering with a focus on workplace safety systems. Her senior project would eventually become a startup company that revolutionized construction site monitoring, preventing the kind of accidents that had killed her father and saving countless lives in the process. But sometimes, late at night in her dormitory room, Maya would put on her father's old construction jacket and remember the shy girl who had once believed that invisibility was her only defense against the world's cruelty. That girl had died in an abandoned gymnasium, struck down by electricity that never found its target. What had emerged from that death was someone who understood that justice sometimes required you to fight for it, and that the most dangerous opponents were often those who looked weakest from the outside. Blake Morrison had wanted to see who Maya Chen really was. By the time he finally understood the answer to that question, it was far too late to matter. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.